My name is Clara Jenkins, and I was 29 years old when my sister looked me in the eye, snatched my Thanksgiving dinner right off the table, and scraped it into the garbage. We were sitting in my parents' dining room in suburban Pennsylvania, surrounded by crystal glasses and the heavy smell of roasted turkey and dried sage. Vanessa stood over the trash can with my empty porcelain plate in her hand and told me I did not deserve to eat at their table. She wore a silk blouse that cost more than a factory worker makes in a month. She had brought a cruelty to that dinner that I had tolerated for years, but never expected to see paraded so openly. Our parents sat right there. The silver cutlery had barely settled from the scrape of her pulling my plate away, and my own blood was telling me I was worthless. They thought I was just the rebellious daughter who walked away from the family legacy. They thought I was powerless. They thought wrong. Before I tell you exactly whose name was painted on her office door the very next morning, please let me know your age in the comments. And if you love watching toxic families get the reality check they deserve, make sure to subscribe to Sophia Vengeance. To understand why my father laughing at me that night was the final straw, I need to take you back to how Jenkins Manufacturing used to operate. My father, Richard, built a local steel parts factory into a regional supplier. Growing up, the factory was our entire lives. The smell of machine oil and hot metal was practically baked into his clothes. But as the industry modernized, my father refused to adapt. He clung to old methods, old machinery, and old pride. When I graduated with a degree in finance and tried to show him how to save his dying margins, he told me to stay out of the men's work. So I did. I left the family company and built my own portfolio. I spent 7 years working 80-hour weeks learning the steel investment sector from the ground up, identifying failing mills, buying their debt, and restructuring them into profitable enterprises. I lived in a cheap apartment with bad heating while my investments quietly grew into a lucrative private equity fund. Meanwhile, my father handed the vice president title to Vanessa. Vanessa did not know the difference between carbon steel and aluminum. What she did know was how to use the company accounts to lease luxury cars, buy country club memberships, and fund winter trips to Aspen. For 3 years, they bled the factory dry to keep up the appearance of wealth, and for 3 years, they made sure to mock my quiet lifestyle every time I visited. That brings us back to the dining room. I had been invited to Thanksgiving out of a twisted sense of obligation. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, tracing the rim of my water glass. Vanessa was holding court, swirling an expensive Cabernet. She was bragging about the luxury chalet she had just booked in Aspen for February. "I hope you budgeted for the end-of-year bonuses this time," I said quietly. The floor managers were asking about them last month when I ran into Dave from shipping at the grocery store. The room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Vanessa lowered her wine glass, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. "The floor workers get paid what they are worth," she snapped, "and my compensation package is none of your business. You do not even work for us." "I just think a ski trip is a bold choice when the supply accounts are 60 days past due," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. That was when she snapped. Before I could even reach for the carving fork to serve myself a slice of turkey, her manicured fingers clamped onto the edge of my porcelain plate. She yanked it across the tablecloth, rattling the silverware and spilling my water glass. "You do not deserve a seat at this table," she hissed. Her voice carried no heat, just cold, defensive rage. She stood up, carried my plate to the kitchen doorway, stepped on the pedal of the stainless steel trash can, and scraped my entire dinner into the garbage. The heavy thud of the lid echoed in the quiet room. "Not after the way you speak about this family business." Vanessa finished walking back to her seat and smoothing her silk blouse. I did not yell. I looked at my father, waiting for the patriarch to say something, to restore order. Richard took a slow sip of his bourbon. He let out a low chuckle, setting his crystal glass down. He did not look at me. Instead, he lifted a heavy hand and pointed toward the front hallway. "Leave if you cannot respect your sister," he said. The ice clinked against his glass. "We are celebrating. You are souring the room." My mother, Brenda, offered a tight, uncomfortable smile and adjusted the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. "You really should learn to read the room, Clara," she murmured. "Let us not make a scene." I felt the familiar sting at the back of my throat, that childhood urge to argue, to plead my case and prove my worth, but I swallowed it. At 29, I had learned exactly when a negotiation was dead, and this room had been dead for a very long time. I stood up. The fabric of my chair brushed against the expensive wool rug. I did not say a single word. I did not slam the door. Walking out of the dining room and into the foyer, the air turned cooler. On the antique credenza by the front entrance, a stack of mail sat haphazardly tossed aside. The top envelope bore a bold red stamp that said, "Final Notice." Beneath it lay 3 more from different creditors. The illusion of the Aspen trip and the diamond bracelet fractured against the reality of the paper. They were drowning in debt, and their cruelty was just a desperate attempt to feel superior to the only person who could see they were sinking. I pulled my wool coat from the closet. I stepped out onto the porch, the freezing November Pennsylvania wind hitting my face. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled to a contact. The line rang twice. Cole, the voice on the other end, answered. It was David Cole, my acquisitions attorney. I looked back through the frosted glass of the front door, watching the blurred silhouettes of my family raising their glasses in a toast, celebrating my eviction. "David," I said, my breath pluming in the crisp air, "execute the buyout. I want the paperwork finalized by dawn." Monday morning in western Pennsylvania always carried the bitter taste of damp iron and diesel exhaust. For Jenkins Manufacturing, that metallic tang was mixed with the distinct flavor of industrial decay. The factory floor was a vast cavern of concrete and corrugated steel, where the rhythmic pounding of the hydraulic presses usually vibrated right up through the soles of your shoes. Today, however, that pounding felt sluggish and uneven, acting like a tired heartbeat for a company clinging to life support. I knew every single inch of that floor. When I was a teenager, desperately trying to earn my father's approval, I spent my summers sweeping sharp metal shavings and learning the precise calibration of the heavy stamping machines. I learned the realities of the business from the grit up, earning the respect of the foreman while ruining my hands with grease. Vanessa, on the other hand, had never set foot outside the climate-controlled carpeted administrative wing. At exactly 9:15, a silver Porsche Cayenne pulled into the reserved parking spot nearest the front entrance. The lease on that vehicle cost the company $2,000 a month, paid directly from the operational budget that was supposed to fund worker safety upgrades. Vanessa stepped out into the freezing drizzle, wearing a pristine camel hair coat and suede stiletto boots. She carried a designer leather tote bag that could have easily covered the weekly wages of 3 experienced machinists. She walked through the double-glass doors with the practiced, arrogant stride of a monarch surveying her loyal subjects. Her chin was lifted, her expression locked in a perpetual state of mild annoyance. She expected the entire world to scramble out of her way, and for the past 3 years my father had ensured that it did just that. Usually, her arrival triggered a flurry of anxious activity. The front desk receptionist, a woman named Martha, who had dedicated 20 years of her life to the company, would drop whatever she was doing to hand my sister a custom coffee order. The junior accountants would suddenly look very busy at their screens, terrified of catching her eye. But this morning, the administrative wing felt completely different. The air was thick, charged with a strange nervous energy that bordered on electric. As Vanessa walked past the row of cubicles, the usual chorus of polite good mornings was entirely absent. Instead, the staff fell silent. Phones were left ringing on desks, keyboards stopped clicking, people stared. They did not look at her with the fear she was so accustomed to projecting. They looked at her with a mix of pity and quiet anticipation. Vanessa stopped at the reception desk, tapping her manicured fingernails against the laminate counter in a sharp, demanding rhythm. Martha did not scramble to her feet. The older woman simply sat there, her hands folded neatly over a stack of fresh purchase orders, offering a polite but unusually firm smile. Vanessa narrowed her eyes, clearly unnerved by the lack of groveling. She demanded her morning coffee, her voice sharp enough to cut through glass. Martha calmly replied that the coffee machine in the employee break room was functioning perfectly if she wished to pour herself a cup. I could imagine the exact shade of red blooming on my sister's neck at that moment. Vanessa did not argue with the receptionist. She simply scoffed, turned on her heel, and marched down the executive hallway, determined to complain to our father about the sudden, unacceptable breakdown in office discipline. The long hallway leading to the executive suites was lined with framed vintage photographs of our grandfather and father shaking hands with local politicians. At the very end of the corridor stood the heavy oak door of the chief executive office. For 30 years, a tarnished brass nameplate had been mounted at eye level reading, "Richard Jenkins, President." Vanessa reached out to push the door open, but her hand froze just inches from the wood. The brass plate was gone. The 4 screw holes where it used to sit had been filled and polished smooth. In its place, mounted perfectly in the center, was a brand new brushed steel plaque. The lettering was laser engraved, sharp and unapologetically modern. It read, Clara Jenkins, Chief Executive Officer. Vanessa pushed the door open so hard it rebounded off the rubber wall stop with a loud thud. The executive office still smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and old leather, but the desk was entirely transformed. My father's chaotic piles of unopened mail, golf magazines, and unpaid invoices were gone. The mahogany surface was clear save for a single sleek laptop, a steaming cup of black tea, and a tall stack of quarterly financial reports. I was sitting in the high-backed leather chair, reading a profit and loss statement with a red pen in my hand. I did not look up when she barged in. I simply turned a page, letting the crisp sound of the paper slice through the heavy silence of the room. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Vanessa demanded. Her voice cracked, betraying the sheer panic bubbling just beneath her hostile facade. She marched up to the edge of the desk, planting her hands flat on the wood, looming over me in an attempt to intimidate. I finished reading the paragraph on the page before slowly raising my eyes to meet hers. I took in the expensive coat, the flawless makeup, and the raw fury twisting her features. I closed the financial report, capped my pen, and folded my hands neatly on top of the binder. "There is no joke here, Vanessa," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and quiet. "I am reviewing the third quarter expenditures. It appears you authorized a corporate payout of $40,000 for a consultant fee to a firm that does not seem to have a website, a physical address, or a tax identification number. We need to discuss your accounting practices." Vanessa blinked, the color draining rapidly from her face. She tried to maintain her aggressive posture, but her knuckles were turning white against the dark wood of the desk. "Get out of his chair, Clara," she hissed, though her voice lacked its usual commanding sting. "I am calling Dad right now. When he gets here, he is going to have the security guards drag you out of this building for trespassing." I reached into the top drawer of the desk and pulled out a thick, bound legal document. I slid it across the smooth mahogany surface until it rested right in front of her trembling hands. "I did not break into anything," I replied smoothly. "You and Richard defaulted on the primary commercial loans 3 months ago. The bank was preparing to push Jenkins Manufacturing into receivership by the end of the month. My private equity group purchased the entirety of that debt on Friday afternoon. We executed the conversion clauses over the weekend while you were busy picking out ski chalets." I watched her eyes dart down to the legal binder. She did not need to read the fine print to understand the reality of the situation. The embossed seal of my investment firm was stamped on the cover right next to the notarized signatures from the bank executives. The delusion she had been living in was shattering in real time, the pieces falling around her designer boots. The Thanksgiving dinner, where she had thrown my plate in the garbage, felt like a lifetime ago. Just 3 days prior, she had stood in our parents' dining room drunk on unearned power, declaring that I had no place at their table. Now she was standing in my office wearing clothes purchased with mismanaged funds, realizing that the ground had entirely vanished beneath her feet. "You cannot do this," Vanessa whispered, taking a stumbling step backward. "This is our family business. You cannot just steal it from us." I tilted my head, studying her desperate, wide-eyed expression. "I did not steal anything," I stated coldly. "I paid fair market value for a dying asset that you and our father drove into the ground through sheer incompetence. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the former board of directors has been dissolved and restructured. Richard is no longer the president. You are no longer the vice president of operations. Technically speaking, you are currently standing in my office on company time, and you are late for your shift." The reality of the power shift hit her like a physical blow. The sister she had mocked, the woman she had publicly humiliated for choosing hard work over inherited privilege, was now holding the reins of her entire life. But the conflict was far from over. Vanessa reached into her expensive tote bag and pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped it on the floor. She jabbed at the screen to dial our father's number, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "Call him," I offered softly, leaning back into the leather chair and taking a sip of my tea. Tell Richard to hurry, because when he gets here, we are not just going to talk about the corporate takeover. We are going to talk about the fact that I spent the entire weekend auditing your private ledger, and I know exactly how you funded your luxurious winter vacations while the people on this factory floor starved. As my sister held her phone against her ear with trembling fingers, waiting for our father to answer, I watched her carefully constructed reality begin to disintegrate. This is the moment where most people might feel a sudden twinge of pity, watching their own siblings succumb to blind panic. But if you have ever been the designated scapegoat in a family of narcissists, you understand exactly why my pulse rested at a calm 60 beats per minute. To comprehend the sheer terror vibrating through Vanessa right now, you have to look past the designer clothes and understand the grand illusion my family spent the last 3 years frantically building. I was not always the cold, calculating corporate investor sitting behind this mahogany desk. 7 years ago, I was a 22-year-old finance graduate possessing a naive, desperate desire to save my family legacy. Jenkins Manufacturing was bleeding cash, losing market share to overseas competitors and automated facilities. I spent 3 months compiling operational data, analyzing our broken supply chain, and drafting a comprehensive strategy to modernize our smelting processes. I presented that detailed portfolio to my father in this very room, hoping to earn his respect. Richard took one look at my bound report, scoffed loudly, and tossed it directly into the wastebasket. He told me that steel was a gritty man's game and that my modern spreadsheet ideas were deeply disrespectful to the legacy our grandfather had built with his bare hands. When I stood my ground, warning him that his profit margins were mathematically collapsing, he cut me out entirely. He revoked my security badge, removed my name from the family trust documents, and handed the keys to the kingdom over to my older sister. While I spent the next 7 years building my own private equity firm from a cramped studio apartment featuring a radiator that hissed loudly but never actually heated the room, Vanessa played the role of the glamorous industrial heiress. She did not know how to read a basic balance sheet, nor could she distinguish carbon steel from aluminum. What she did excel at was posting perfectly filtered photos from the VIP lounge at the local country club. My father enabled her delusions, utterly convinced that projecting a false image of endless wealth would magically attract new manufacturing contracts. They leased luxury vehicles they could never afford to own. They catered extravagant, pointless luncheons for potential clients who happily ate the food but never signed a single contract. And when the legitimate operational budget inevitably ran dry, they started dipping into the deepest, darkest pockets of the company accounts just to keep the lights on and the champagne flowing. I remember a highly specific Tuesday evening last winter. I was sitting at my cheap particle board kitchen table eating instant noodles and reviewing a municipal bond prospectus under a flickering fluorescent bulb. Vanessa dropped by entirely unannounced. She claimed she was driving through my rundown neighborhood because her navigation system malfunctioned, though we both knew she simply wanted an audience to flaunt her latest purchases. She stood in the center of my tiny living room, wearing a plush cashmere coat and a pair of brilliant diamond stud earrings that caught the terrible lighting of my apartment. She looked at my peeling wallpaper, wrinkling her nose, as if the very air in my home was toxic. She asked how I could tolerate living in such pathetic squalor when I could have just apologized to our father and taken a comfortable, quiet, administrative job fetching her coffee. She paraded her wealth in my face, weaponizing her inherited status to remind me that I was the outcast, the failure, the daughter, who had amounted to nothing. I did not argue with her that night. I let her enjoy her hollow moment of supreme arrogance. But looking at the digital trail in the private corporate ledger this past weekend, I discovered the sickening hidden truth about that particular Tuesday. The dates matched flawlessly. Just 4 hours before Vanessa stood in my freezing apartment mocking my humble living conditions, she had logged into the secure payroll system. She deliberately diverted $5,000 from the factory workers' overtime fund directly into her personal checking account. She bought those diamond earrings using the literal sweat and torn muscles of men who were struggling to feed their own children. That is the true reality of the Jenkins family. They were not wealthy, respected titans of industry. They were desperate parasites feeding on the rotting corpse of a once great company. And that brings everything into sharp focus regarding the Thanksgiving dinner eviction. When I sat at that beautiful mahogany table on Thursday and casually mentioned the unpaid supply accounts I punctured, their fragile balloon of delusion. Drowning people do not think rationally. They flail blindly in the dark. They claw desperately at whoever is standing closest to them on the sinking ship. Vanessa throwing my dinner in the garbage and my father ordering me out into the freezing night was never truly about me being disrespectful. It was a frantic, pathetic attempt to assert dominance over the only person in the room who possessed the skills to see they were going under. They needed to make me feel small so they could pretend they were still giants. Vanessa pressed her phone harder against her ear, her breath catching sharply. The line finally connected. I could hear the faint, gravelly sound of our father answering from the other end. "Dad!" she gasped, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of the polished sophistication she usually wore like armor. "You need to get down to the factory right now. It is Clara. She is sitting in your office. She is saying she owns the building." I remained perfectly still, leaning back in the heavy leather chair, listening to the muffled shouting bleeding through the mobile receiver. Richard was demanding explanations, his booming voice echoing tinny and small through the speaker. Vanessa was hyperventilating, real tears streaking her expensive foundation and smudging her carefully applied mascara. She pleaded with him to hurry, insisting hysterically that I had forged legal documents and broken into the executive wing to stage a coup. She hung up the phone and glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion. "He is 10 minutes away," she spat, crossing her arms defensively across her soaked blouse. "You are going to jail for this stunt." I did not bother to correct her flawed legal assumptions. Instead, I simply reached into the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a second, much thinner folder. This one was not officially stamped with my investment firm logo. This one contained the freshly printed screenshots of her personal bank transfers, the fake vendor invoices routed to shell corporations, and the internal memos she had clumsily tried to delete from the server. The corporate takeover documented in the thick binder was airtight, but that was just standard business practice. What I held in my hands right now was devastating criminal evidence. I placed the thin folder neatly on top of the thick acquisition binder, aligning the edges perfectly. 10 minutes would be exactly enough time for me to organize the embezzlement files before Richard arrived, blissfully unaware that he was driving his expensive leased car directly into a steel trap that would tear his patriarchal authority into unrecoverable pieces. Exactly 9 minutes later, the heavy glass doors at the front of the administrative wing swung open with enough force to rattle the window panes in their aluminum frames. The rhythmic clicking of Martha typing at the reception desk halted instantly. Heavy, deliberate footsteps thundered down the carpeted hallway. I did not need to look up from my quarterly reports to know who was approaching. My father walked with the punishing stride of a man who believed the earth itself owed him a favor for gracing it with his presence. Growing up, Richard Jenkins dictated the emotional weather of our entire household. If he woke up in a foul mood, the rest of the family walked on tiptoe, speaking in hushed whispers to avoid triggering his explosive temper. His anger was the undisputed law of the land. He used his booming voice and imposing physical stature to bulldoze through every disagreement, whether he was negotiating a steel contract or deciding what we watched on television. For nearly 3 decades, I had been conditioned to shrink away from the sound of those approaching footsteps. Today, however, my pulse remained steady. Richard burst into the executive suite, his face flushed a deep mottled red. He wore his tailored charcoal suit like a suit of armor, his silk tie slightly loosened at the collar. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as his eyes darted around the room, taking in the empty space where his brass nameplate used to be, the missing clutter on the desk, and finally, his youngest daughter, sitting casually in his leather chair. Vanessa immediately scrambled away from the wall and rushed to his side. She grabbed his arm, pointing a manicured finger at me while putting on a flawless display of victimhood. "Tell her to get out," Dad, Vanessa pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured tears. "She is trying to ruin everything." Richard shrugged off her grip and marched directly toward the mahogany desk. He planted his feet firmly, leaned his substantial weight forward, and brought both of his closed fists down onto the polished wood. The impact rattled my ceramic teacup in its saucer. "What is the meaning of this nonsense, Clara?" he bellowed, his voice vibrating with raw, unfiltered fury. "Get out of my chair immediately before I call the local authorities and have you hauled out of here in handcuffs." I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. I picked up my teacup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it gently back down on the coaster. "You can certainly dial the police if it makes you feel better, Richard," I replied evenly. "But the responding officers are going to ask for proof of ownership to determine who is actually trespassing on this property. And unfortunately for you, your name is no longer on the deed." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You have lost your mind," he sneered, leaning closer, so I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I built this company. I own every single piece of machinery on that floor, and I own this building." I placed my hand flat on top of the thick legal binder sitting between us. I pushed the heavy portfolio across the smooth surface of the desk. It came to a stop right against his knuckles. "You did own it," I corrected him, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, "right up until you missed your third consecutive payment on the consolidated commercial loans you took out 3 years ago. You leveraged the factory equipment and the property deed to secure those funds. The grace period expired last Tuesday. First National Bank initiated the default protocols on Wednesday morning." Richard stared at the binder, the color beginning to drain from his flushed cheeks. His bravado faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked it with another layer of bluster. "The bank and I have an understanding," he insisted, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. "I spoke to the loan officer last week. We were restructuring the terms." "You were begging for an extension that they had no intention of granting," I stated plainly. The bank viewed Jenkins Manufacturing as a toxic asset. They wanted the debt off their books before the fiscal quarter ended. So my private equity group approached them on Friday afternoon. "We offered to purchase your defaulted loans in cash for pennies on the dollar." They happily transferred the entire debt portfolio to my firm. I gestured toward the binder. "Open it," I suggested quietly. Richard hesitated. His hands hovered over the cover. The psychological shift in the room was palpable. The imposing patriarch was slowly shrinking into a frightened debtor. He flipped the heavy cover open. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything to prove I was lying. He turned page after page, the silence in the room stretching out, broken only by the sound of rustling paper, and Vanessa taking quick, shallow breaths near the doorway. He finally reached the signature pages. He saw the official bank seals, the transfer of deed, the conversion of debt to equity, and the notarized documents legally dissolving his board of directors. The paper trail was an impenetrable fortress, designed by top-tier acquisitions attorneys and executed flawlessly, while he was carving a turkey and laughing at my expense. His hands began to shake. The thick parchment trembled between his fingers. He dropped the binder back onto the desk and stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The patriarchal authority he had wielded like a weapon his entire life was entirely void. His anger meant nothing here. His booming voice held zero currency. "Clara," he started, his tone suddenly dropping an octave, shifting from wrath to a sickening artificial warmth. "You need to listen to me. We are family. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." I watched him attempt the pivot. When intimidation failed, Richard always resorted to emotional manipulation. It was a strategy he had perfected over decades. He would break you down and then offer a tiny sliver of affection to make you feel grateful for the abuse. "I am your father," he continued, his voice taking on a pleading, desperate quality. "Everything I have done, I did to protect the Jenkins legacy. This factory is your grandfather's dream. You cannot just strip it away from us. Think about Thanksgiving. I was just trying to teach you a lesson about respect. I was tough on you because I knew you had potential." I looked at the man who had laughed while my sister scraped my dinner into the garbage. I looked at the man who had ordered me out into the freezing night simply because I dared to point out his financial mismanagement. "You are right about one thing," I replied softly. "You did teach me a lesson about respect. You taught me that respect is not inherited, and it certainly cannot be extorted. It must be earned, and you lost mine a very long time ago." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Please, Clara," he whispered, dropping the facade entirely. "We will fix this. We can work together. I will give you a seat on the board." "There is no board left for me to sit on," I countered, tapping a manicured finger against the mahogany wood. "I own all the voting shares. The corporate restructuring took effect at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, which brings us to your current employment status." Vanessa gasped, stepping forward. "You cannot fire us!" she cried out, her face twisted in genuine horror. I turned my gaze toward my sister, taking in her pristine camel hair coat and her panicked eyes. "I am not firing anyone yet," I clarified. "But as of 8 o'clock this morning, the two of you are technically my employees. Your salaries, your benefits, and your access to the corporate accounts are now subject to my direct approval." Richard sagged against the desk, looking like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. The financial checkmate was undeniable. The keys to his kingdom rested firmly in my pocket, and the heavy chains of familial obligation had been severed cleanly by cold, hard numbers. But Vanessa was not finished. Her sense of entitlement ran far deeper than our father's pride. She realized that the executive suite was lost, that the paperwork was insurmountable. Her eyes darkened with a new frantic scheme. She turned on her stiletto heels and bolted toward the heavy oak door. If she could not win the battle in the boardroom, she was going to take the war directly to the factory floor, fully intending to turn the entire workforce against the sister who had just dethroned her. The heavy oak door of the executive suite slammed shut, leaving my father leaning against the mahogany desk in stunned silence. I did not rush to follow my sister. Panic makes people clumsy, and I wanted to give Vanessa ample time to dig her own grave on the factory floor. I took a moment to adjust my tailored blazer, picked up a thick manila envelope I had prepared earlier that morning, and walked out into the carpeted hallway. The administrative wing was still frozen in a state of quiet shock. The reception area remained eerily silent as I passed through the double doors leading to the industrial sector. The transition from the plush corporate offices to the manufacturing floor was always jarring. You step through a reinforced steel threshold, and the climate-controlled air is instantly replaced by the oppressive heat of the smelting furnaces. The scent of expensive cologne gives way to the sharp metallic tang of ozone grease and burning carbon. This environment was my true classroom. While Vanessa spent her teenage summers attending tennis camps and lounging by country club pools, I was down here. I learned how to read a micrometer before I learned how to drive. I knew the specific grinding noise a hydraulic press made right before a bearing failed. I knew the names of the men and women who sacrificed their physical health to keep the Jenkins family living in suburban luxury. I descended the metal-grated staircase overlooking the main assembly line. Below me, production had ground to a complete halt. Vanessa had managed to gather the shift supervisors and dozens of floor workers near the central loading bay. She was standing on top of a wooden shipping pallet, attempting to elevate herself above the crowd in her suede stiletto boots. Her camel hair coat looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of oily concrete and towering machinery. She was shouting, waving her arms in a frantic attempt to whip the confused workers into a frenzy. I paused on the bottom step, letting the ambient hum of the ventilation fans mask my arrival. I wanted to hear exactly how she intended to spin her sudden loss of power. "This is a hostile corporate takeover," Vanessa cried out, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous room. "Clara is trying to destroy everything our grandfather built. She does not care about any of you. She is a soulless equity raider who just wants to liquidate our assets and sell your jobs to the lowest bidder overseas. We have to stand together. We have to walk out right now to show her that Jenkins Manufacturing answers to the Jenkins family, not some greedy outsider." The crowd of workers remained largely silent, exchanging skeptical glances. These were seasoned machinists, welders, and logistics coordinators. They wore heavy canvas jackets, stained with rust, and protective goggles scuffed from years of flying sparks. They lived in a reality defined by hourly wages, overtime disputes, and the rising cost of groceries. They did not care about the grand legacy of our grandfather. They cared about their mortgages. Marcus, the senior floor manager, stepped forward. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with calloused hands and a permanent streak of soot across his forehead. I remembered Marcus perfectly. He had taught me how to properly secure a load on a flatbed truck when I was 16 years old. "With all due respect," Vanessa Marcus said, his deep voice cutting through her hysterical pitch, "we just want to know if our paychecks are going to clear this Friday. The supply vendors are refusing our calls. We barely have enough raw aluminum to finish the current production run." Vanessa waved her manicured hand dismissively, treating his legitimate operational concern like a minor annoyance. "That is exactly what she wants you to focus on," she snapped. "She is trying to distract you from the bigger picture. If we do not strike right now, my father will lose the company. You owe him your loyalty. He gave you these jobs." I stepped off the metal staircase, my low heels clicking against the concrete floor. The sound was not loud, but the workers nearest the stairs noticed me immediately. The crowd began to part, creating a clear path between myself and the shipping pallet where my sister stood. "They do not owe Richard anything," I said, keeping my voice calm and projected. "Employment is a mutual contract, not a feudal oath. You exchange your labor for fair compensation, and lately that compensation has been severely lacking." Vanessa spun around, her eyes wide and wild. "Do not listen to her," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "She is lying. She forged the bank documents." I walked directly toward Marcus, completely ignoring my sister's frantic performance. I stopped a few feet away from the senior floor manager and met his tired, weathered gaze. "Hello, Marcus," I said warmly. "I heard your wife had that knee replacement surgery last month. I hope her recovery is going smoothly." Marcus blinked, clearly surprised that I remembered a detail from a brief conversation we had shared nearly a year ago. "She is doing much better, Clara," he replied cautiously. "Thank you for asking." I nodded, then turned to face the rest of the gathered workforce. "I am not here to liquidate your jobs," I announced, ensuring my words reached the back of the crowd. "I am here to secure them. For the past 3 years, you have been told that profit margins were too tight to approve equipment upgrades. You were told that the end-of-year bonuses had to be indefinitely delayed because the regional market was suffering a downturn. You were told to work harder, work longer, and sacrifice your personal time for the good of the family legacy." I held up the thick manila envelope I had carried down from the executive suite. I pulled the tab, opening the flap. "The regional market was never suffering a downturn," I continued, pulling out a thick stack of printed rectangular slips. "The profit margins were fine. The operational budget was drained because the former vice president of operations decided her personal lifestyle was more important than your financial stability." Vanessa let out a sharp gasp, stepping down from the wooden pallet. "Clara, shut your mouth right now," she hissed, marching toward me. I turned my back on her, keeping my attention entirely on the workers. "The corporate ledger shows that your collective bonuses were fully funded and approved by the accounting department on the 2nd of November, I stated clearly. "But those funds never reached your accounts. The authorization forms were intercepted and frozen." I looked directly at Dave, the shipping coordinator, standing near the front. "Dave, you have a daughter starting her freshman year at Penn State next fall, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Dave answered, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Your scheduled bonus was $3,000, I said, locating the specific envelope in the stack and holding it out to him. "That money was frozen, so the executive suite could afford a $5,000 deposit on a luxury ski chalet in Aspen." A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the factory floor. The ambient hum of the machinery seemed to fade away. Dozens of pairs of eyes shifted from me to Vanessa. The look in their eyes was no longer skeptical. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. Vanessa froze in her tracks. Her face flushed a brilliant, painful crimson. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of excuse, but no words came out. The pristine camel hair coat and the designer boots suddenly looked like the uniform of a thief. I handed Dave his envelope. He took it, staring at my sister with a look of deep disgust. I moved down the line, reading names and handing out the checks I had personally authorized and printed early that morning. "Marcus," I said, handing the floor manager his envelope, $4,000, frozen to pay the lease on a silver Porsche Cayenne. "Sarah," I said, turning to the lead quality control inspector, $2,500, frozen to cover a catered luncheon at the local country club that generated 0 manufacturing contracts. The illusion was entirely shattered. This is the stark reality of modern American labor. These people did not care about aristocratic family drama. They cared about competence, transparency, and being paid what they were owed. I did not need to shout or demand their allegiance. I simply handed them the truth, backed by the financial compensation they had rightfully earned. "You are all dismissed back to your stations," I announced, handing out the last few envelopes. "The new production schedules will be distributed by noon. The supply vendors have been paid in full, and the new aluminum shipments will arrive tomorrow morning. Let us get this facility back to work." The workers did not cheer. They were too professional for theatrical displays. But as they turned their backs on my sister and walked back to their machines, the message was profoundly clear. Vanessa was dead to them. The golden child, the supposed heir to the industrial throne, had been publicly exposed as a fraud. Vanessa stood completely alone in the center of the loading bay, her shoulders slumped, her arrogant posture dissolving into a posture of sheer humiliation. The people she used to command without a second thought would never respect her again. Her crumbling self-image was painful to witness, but I felt no sympathy. She had stolen their livelihoods to buy diamond earrings. I pulled my smartphone from my blazer pocket. I opened my digital notepad and began typing deliberately, ensuring she could see exactly what I was doing. "What are you writing?" she whispered, her voice hollow and defeated. "I am documenting a formal incident of gross insubordination," I replied, coldly tapping the screen. "Attempting to incite an unauthorized labor strike and disrupting the manufacturing floor is a severe violation of your employment contract. This constitutes grounds for immediate termination with cause." Vanessa stared at me, her eyes filling with terrified tears. I was building a pristine, undeniable legal trap, tightening the corporate noose with every move she made. She realized she had played directly into my hands. She turned and fled, her stiletto heels clicking frantically as she ran back toward the metal staircase, desperate to escape the judging eyes of the factory floor. I watched her go, slipping my phone back into my pocket. She would undoubtedly run straight to our mother to cry about how unfairly she was being treated. I smiled thinly, welcoming the next phase of the battle. The bitter aroma of roasted espresso beans mixed with the sharp, damp chill of early winter blowing through the cafe doors. I chose a secluded corner booth in a bustling coffeehouse nestled in downtown Pittsburgh, far away from the industrial smog of the factory district. My fingers traced the smooth edge of my digital tablet, scrolling through pages of chaotic financial records. The rhythmic clatter of ceramic mugs and the low hum of casual conversation provided a temporary shield against the morning corporate warfare. I required a strong dose of caffeine to untangle the sheer volume of fiscal ruin I had just inherited from my estranged relatives. A sudden gust of freezing wind swept through the establishment as the front entrance swung open. The draft carried a distinct, highly artificial fragrance, heavy floral perfume intertwined with expensive botanical hairspray. I did not need to lift my gaze from the glowing screen to recognize the intruder. Brenda Jenkins navigated the narrow aisles between crowded tables with a calculated, predatory grace. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, a silk scarf, and a string of authentic pearls resting against her collarbone. My mother possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural radar for tracking my location whenever a crisis threatened her comfortable existence. She slid into the leather seating opposite mine, offering no greeting and asking for no invitation. Her manicured hands gripped a designer handbag tightly against her chest, her knuckles pale with tension. To a casual observer, she presented the perfect image of a distressed, elegant matriarch seeking solace from a trusted loved one. I knew the truth beneath the polished veneer. During my childhood, Brenda served as the silent architect of our toxic household dynamics. Whenever my father unleashed his explosive temper, shattering dishes and shouting down opinions, she never intervened to defend her children. Instead, she waited for the storm to pass, then cornered me in the hallway, insisting I apologize for provoking him, just to maintain a fragile fake peace. Our culture places a heavy, unspoken burden on the shoulders of daughters. Society expects us to function as emotional shock absorbers for our families. We are trained from birth to shrink our ambitions, swallow our justifiable pride, and smooth over the jagged edges of the male ego. Brenda mastered this subservient role decades ago and fully intended for me to inherit the invisible yoke. When I forged a different path, choosing to build a lucrative steel investment portfolio rather than placating a fragile patriarch, My mother viewed my financial independence as a direct, unforgivable insult to her own life choices. "Clara," she breathed out, her tone dripping with practiced vulnerability and breathy desperation. "Thank goodness I finally located you. I have been dialing your cellular number all morning." I locked my device screen, picked up my porcelain cup, and took a slow, measured sip of black coffee. "You possess my professional contact information," I replied evenly, ignoring her theatrical distress. "My executive assistant filters all incoming communications to prevent unauthorized interruptions. You bypass standard corporate channels to stage a public ambush. Speak plainly. What is your objective?" Her lower lip commenced a visible quiver. A single, perfectly timed droplet of moisture spilled over her darkened eyelashes, tracing a careful path down her powdered cheek, without smudging her makeup. She reached across the small wooden table, attempting to intertwine her fingers with mine. I swiftly retracted my arm, letting her polished nails scrape against the bare, varnished wood. "Please," she whispered, pitching her voice to a frequency of desperate pleading intended to garner sympathy from nearby patrons. "You must halt this hostile crusade immediately. You are tearing our family apart." "Your father is no longer a resilient youth," Brenda continued, withdrawing her rejected hand and clutching her scarf. His blood pressure spiked to a terrifying level after he departed the administrative wing today. He is currently experiencing severe chest palpitations. The cardiologist issued a stern warning regarding his cardiovascular health last year. If you force this hostile takeover through the judicial system, the resulting anxiety will trigger a fatal heart attack. You will bear the ultimate responsibility for sending your own flesh and blood to an early grave. I scrutinized her facial features with analytical precision. I searched for genuine lines of panic around her eyes or a chaotic rhythm in her breathing. There was nothing but cool, rehearsed calculation beneath the heavy wool coat. She was deploying the ultimate weapon in the maternal arsenal, weaponizing biological guilt to override logical business decisions. For a fleeting microsecond, the ghost of a younger, softer version of myself felt the urge to cave, to sign the reversal documents, and restore the comfortable, familiar illusion of parental approval. However, that naive version of Clara perished on a Thursday evening in November. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table, closing the physical distance between us. "Where were these tragic tears 4 days ago?" I asked, dropping my volume to a frigid whisper that forced her to lean closer to hear me. "When your eldest daughter snatched my holiday meal and scraped it into a garbage disposal, you sat there, adjusting your jewelry. When Richard ordered me out into the freezing night air, you chuckled and instructed me to read the room. You harbored zero concern for my emotional or physical well-being when you tossed me onto the street," I noted, watching the counterfeit sorrow evaporate from her expression. "You did not shed a solitary tear for your youngest child. You only weep when your personal luxury is placed in jeopardy. So do not sit in this cafe and pretend this visit revolves around cardiovascular health. We both recognize that Richard possesses the physical constitution of a draft horse. He is not suffering a medical emergency. He is throwing a temper tantrum because his unlimited checkbook has been permanently revoked." Brenda stiffened noticeably. The trembling vulnerability vanished into thin air, instantly replaced by a rigid, chilling pragmatism. Her jaw set into a harsh, unforgiving line. "You are acting horribly selfish," she hissed, discarding the peacemaker disguise entirely. "You possess your own wealth. You own a luxury condominium and run a profitable private equity firm. We require that manufacturing facility to survive." I tapped my index finger against the dark glass of my tablet. "You do not require the factory to produce steel parts," I corrected her, my voice carrying the weight of undisputed facts. "You need it because you utilize the property as collateral for a much darker, highly secretive gamble." I spent the early morning hours auditing the secondary liens attached to the industrial real estate. The primary commercial bank loans were standard, but the subordinate debt structure you established was truly fascinating. I watched her throat swallow hard, the pearls shifting nervously against her skin. "Someone authorized a staggering withdrawal of equity against the industrial assets," I explained softly, ensuring no one else could overhear the ruinous truth. They tied corporate real estate directly to personal retirement accounts. You and Richard quietly leveraged your entire financial future to keep the illusion of Jenkins Manufacturing afloat. You drained your mutual funds, your pension reserves, and your joint savings, using the factory deed as a blind guarantee. When my firm purchased the defaulted debt and executed the legal takeover, I did not merely acquire a struggling smelting facility. I accidentally seized the collateral holding your retirement funds hostage. You are firmly trapped inside your own web of deceit. If I liquidate the company assets to balance the corporate sheets, those secondary liens will automatically trigger. The creditors will seize your suburban estate and every remaining dollar in your personal accounts to cover the staggering deficit. Brenda turned a ghastly, sickening shade of pale. Her perfectly styled exterior shattered instantly, revealing a terrified, aging woman facing the grim prospect of total destitution. "You cannot do that," she choked out, her voice barely a raspy whisper. "We will lose everything we own. We will end up on the street. You must sign the ownership papers back over to your father today. We can secure a new line of credit. We just need a little more time to fix the margins." "There is no more time left on the clock," I replied, my tone devoid of any residual sympathy. "You spent the past 3 years funding a fake aristocratic lifestyle, while the actual business burned to ashes. You stole wages from the floor workers, you lied to your creditors, and you treated me like dirt beneath your expensive shoes. I am not going to sacrifice my professional integrity or my investors' capital to rescue you from the consequences of your own staggering vanity." I retrieved my tablet, sliding out of the cramped leather booth. I stood over my mother, looking down at the woman who had spent decades demanding I shrink myself to fit her narrow, subservient worldview. "I will not sign a single page," I declared firmly. "The corporate restructuring is final and irreversible." Brenda grabbed the sleeve of my blazer, her grip shockingly strong for a woman her size. "Please," she begged, all pretense of dignity gone. "Vanessa promised us she had a viable plan to generate new revenue. She swore the new vendor contracts were going to save the quarterly projections." I gently but firmly pried her trembling fingers off my clothing, smoothing the wrinkled fabric. "Vanessa does not hold any new vendor contracts," I stated, turning away from the table and heading toward the exit. "But she does hold a series of very interesting shell corporations registered under her personal name, and I am heading back to the executive suite right now to find out exactly how much money your golden child has been secretly embezzling from all of us." The drive back to the industrial district offered a stark transition from the polished cafes of downtown. I watched the skyline shift from gleaming glass skyscrapers to squat brick warehouses and towering smokestacks venting steam into the night sky. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon by the time I parked my vehicle in the empty executive lot. The silver Porsche was gone. My sister and father had retreated to lick their wounds, leaving me alone to dissect the corpse of Jenkins Manufacturing. I unlocked the heavy glass doors and stepped into the administrative wing. The reception area was submerged in shadow, illuminated only by the faint green glow of emergency exit signs. I walked down the silent corridor, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. Beyond the reinforced doors separating the offices from the manufacturing sector, I could hear the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the cooling pumps and the deep vibrations of the ventilation system. The factory never truly slept. It breathed. It possessed a gritty, mechanical pulse that I found infinitely more comforting than the hollow conversations of my childhood home. I entered the chief executive suite, switched on the brass desk lamp, and stripped off my tailored blazer. The digital files I had reviewed earlier were illuminating, but digital trails can be manipulated. If you want to find the true rot within a failing enterprise, you have to dig into the physical paperwork. You have to smell the ink and feel the weight of the receipts. I spent the next 3 hours hauling heavy cardboard archive boxes from the storage closet into the center of the room. Dust motes danced in the pool of yellow light spilling across the mahogany desk. I rolled up my sleeves, poured a glass of tepid water, and began the grueling process of cross-referencing the physical accounts payable ledgers against the digital banking statements from the past 36 months. Financial auditing is not glamorous work. It is an exercise in endurance and pattern recognition. I traced columns of numbers with the tip of a red pen, my eyes burning from the strain. Most of the expenditures were typical markers of horrific mismanagement. Exorbitant catering bills for unearned celebrations, thousands of dollars funneled into meaningless public relations campaigns. But around 2 in the morning, the numbers stopped looking like simple incompetence. They began to look like deliberate theft. My pen hovered over a recurring line item. A company listed as Apex Industrial Supply was receiving substantial monthly payouts. The invoices claimed they were providing specialized lubricating oils and replacement ball bearings for the heavy hydraulic presses. The amounts were carefully calculated to fall just underneath the threshold that would trigger an automatic external audit. $7,000 here, $9,000 there, a steady, uninterrupted flow of cash bleeding out of the operational budget. I closed the ledger and pulled up the inventory manifests on my laptop. I cross-checked the delivery dates listed on the Apex invoices against the receiving logs signed by the dock workers. The dates did not match. In fact, the receiving logs showed no deliveries of lubricating oils or ball bearings on those specific days. Our foremen were sourcing those exact materials from a completely different legitimate supplier based in Ohio. The factory was paying for ghost materials. I felt a cold, sharp focus settle over my mind. I opened a new browser window and accessed the state corporate registry database. I typed Apex Industrial Supply into the search bar. The results populated instantly. The company was not a manufacturer. It was a limited liability corporation, a shell entity registered in Delaware to obscure its true ownership. But criminals who act out of greed often act with profound laziness. They leave fingerprints. I pulled the incorporation documents and examined the registered agent details. The agent was a generic legal service, but the mailing address routed to a post office box in a wealthy suburb just 20 miles north. I knew that zip code intimately. It was the exact same neighborhood where Vanessa rented her luxury townhome. I dug deeper, accessing the bank routing numbers attached to the fraudulent invoices. I compared them against the personal banking information I had extracted from the intercepted bonus checks earlier that day. The routing numbers were identical. The money leaving Jenkins Manufacturing for fake machine oil was being deposited directly into an account controlled by my older sister. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Vanessa had not just frozen worker bonuses to buy diamond earrings and lease sports cars. She had constructed a systematic, premeditated embezzlement scheme. She was actively stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own family business to sustain the illusion of her aristocratic lifestyle. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the silence of the executive suite pressing in on me. The rhythmic thrum of the factory floor beneath my feet felt like a ticking clock. The conflict had just shifted axis. This was no longer a civil dispute over corporate ownership or a bitter family squabble over unpaid debts. This was a felony. If I handed these physical ledgers and the corresponding digital records over to the state authorities, Vanessa would not just lose her job and her leased vehicle. She would face severe criminal charges. She would be looking at mandatory prison time for corporate fraud, grand larceny, and wire fraud. The sister who had haughtily scraped my Thanksgiving dinner into the garbage, claiming I did not deserve a seat at the table, had been funding her designer wardrobe by committing federal crimes. I held the keys to the business, but more importantly, I now held the keys to her literal freedom. I picked up the fake Apex invoice, feeling the cheap paper between my fingertips. The sheer audacity of her scheme was breathtaking. She had looked our father in the eye every single day, playing the role of the dutiful, brilliant heir, while simultaneously robbing him blind. And Richard, blinded by his own toxic favoritism and patriarchal pride, had handed her the vault combination. I placed the incriminating documents into a fresh manila folder and locked it inside the bottom drawer of the desk. My strategy needed to adapt. I could not simply fire her. I needed to leverage this discovery to ensure my family could never challenge my ownership or retaliate against my investment group. I stretched my aching back, intending to pack up my belongings and catch a few hours of sleep before the morning shift arrived. But as I reached for my blazer, my eyes caught sight of a peculiar document sticking out from the very bottom of the last archive box. It was not a standard vendor invoice or a payroll receipt. It was printed on heavy cream-colored legal stock, the kind of paper favored by high-end corporate law firms. I knelt down and pulled the document free. The header bore the logo of a firm I recognized immediately, and a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down my spine. It was a preliminary agreement drafted by Vanguard Capital. They were a notorious vulture capitalist firm famous within the steel industry for aggressive predatory lending practices. They did not restructure failing businesses. They stripped them down to the studs, liquidated the assets, and left the remaining workers destitute. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, searching for the signature line. There, scrawled in bold blue ink, was my father's distinct handwriting. The date next to his signature was exactly 1 week prior to my own buyout. Richard had panicked. Before I executed my legal takeover, he had secretly signed a disastrous contract with sharks desperate for a cash injection to hide the financial ruin Vanessa had caused. The embezzlement was a devastating internal rot, but this document represented a lethal external threat. My family had not just destroyed themselves, they had invited a monster into the house, and I was going to have to fight a war on 2 fronts to keep the factory standing. The first light of dawn crept through the horizontal blinds of the executive suite, painting pale gray stripes across the mahogany desk. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes felt like they were lined with sand, and the half-empty cup of coffee beside my elbow had long since turned cold and bitter. I sat, frozen in the high-backed leather chair, staring at the cream-colored legal document resting under the glow of the brass lamp. Vanguard Capital. In the private equity sector, that name carried a distinct corrosive weight. They were not investors, they were scavengers. My firm specialized in identifying distressed industrial assets, purchasing their debt, and restructuring the operations to save the underlying business. We built things back up. Vanguard did the exact opposite. They preyed on desperate dying companies, offering predatory loans with astronomical interest rates and draconian penalty clauses. When the inevitable default occurred, they swooped in, stripped the company down to the copper wiring, liquidated the machinery, and left the local workforce standing in the unemployment line. I knew their playbook intimately. Years ago, I had watched a similar firm gut a historic steel mill over in Bethlehem. They left behind a rusted, hollow husk of a town and walked away with tens of millions in profit. Now Vanguard was at my front door, and they held a contract bearing my father's signature. The date on the preliminary agreement was the most chilling detail. Richard had signed it just 6 days ago. He had known the primary commercial loans were defaulting. He had known the bank was preparing to push Jenkins Manufacturing into receivership. Instead of admitting defeat or seeking legitimate counsel, his fragile pride drove him into the arms of loan sharks. He had authorized a mezzanine financing arrangement, pledging a controlling interest in the factory assets in exchange for a rapid cash injection. He wanted to plug the holes in a sinking ship, blissfully unaware that Vanessa was the one drilling those holes through her embezzlement scheme. The low hum of the factory floor shifted in pitch. The morning shift was arriving. The hydraulic presses began their rhythmic, punishing cadence, vibrating up through the floorboards. I closed the Vanguard contract, slid it into the locked drawer alongside the evidence of my sister's theft, and stood up to stretch my aching spine. I walked into the attached executive washroom, splashed freezing water onto my face, and buttoned my tailored blazer. I needed to project total control. The intercom on my desk buzzed a few minutes past 8 o'clock. Clara Martha said, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "There is a gentleman here to see you. He bypassed the visitor log entirely. He says he represents Vanguard Capital and he is insisting on an immediate audience." "Send him back," I replied smoothly. I returned to my seat, folding my hands neatly on the clean surface of the desk. A moment later, the heavy oak doors swung open. The man who entered did not look like a traditional corporate raider. He was tall, lean, and moved with a relaxed feline grace that suggested he was perfectly comfortable walking into hostile territory. He wore a bespoke navy suit that draped flawlessly across his shoulders. He did not carry a briefcase. He held a single, slim leather portfolio. Miles Thorne, he introduced himself, offering a brief, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. He walked directly to the guest chairs opposite my desk and sat down without waiting for an invitation. He crossed one leg over the other, adjusting the pristine crease of his trousers. I remained silent, studying the subtle cues of his body language. He was projecting supreme confidence designed to unnerve me. I simply waited, letting the silence stretch until the friction in the room became palpable. "You run a very tight operation, Ms. Jenkins," Thorne began, leaning back and resting his hands on the arms of the chair. "Your acquisition of this facility over the weekend was a textbook maneuver. Fast, clean, and highly efficient. I respect your firm's track record." "I appreciate the compliment, Mr. Thorne," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, "though I doubt you drove all this way on a Tuesday morning just to praise my investment strategy." He offered that hollow smile again, unzipping the leather portfolio resting on his lap. "We have a slight jurisdictional overlap," he explained, pulling out a pristine copy of the exact same agreement I had discovered in the archive box. "It appears your father, acting in his capacity as president of Jenkins Manufacturing, entered into a binding financing covenant with my firm prior to your buyout." Thorne slid the document across the mahogany wood. I did not bother looking down at it. I kept my gaze locked on his face. "Richard Jenkins possessed no legal authority to pledge those assets," I stated clearly. "The machinery and the real estate were already fully leveraged as collateral against the primary commercial loans held by First National Bank. You cannot promise the same asset to two different creditors. When my equity group purchased the primary debt and executed the conversion clauses, your mezzanine agreement was instantly rendered void." Thorne chuckled softly, a dry, rasping sound. "I am well aware of the primary liens," he said. "Vanguard does not write sloppy contracts. We anticipated a potential senior debt default. If you read Section 4, Paragraph B, you will find a rather specific penalty clause." I knew exactly what that clause entailed, but I let him explain it. "Your father warranted that the company was not facing imminent insolvency," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet cadence. "He signed representations guaranteeing the operational health of the facility. Since those representations were materially false, the penalty clause is triggered. It grants Vanguard the right to file an immediate injunction against any change of ownership, tying up the entire estate in civil litigation." He leaned forward, dropping the relaxed posture. He wanted to ensure I felt the full weight of the threat. "If you attempt to finalize this acquisition and lock us out, we will sue your private equity firm for tortious interference and breach of contract," Thorne said. "We will freeze every asset in this building. The supply chains will halt. The payroll accounts will be locked. We will drag you through discovery for the next 36 months. This factory will suffocate and die before you ever get the chance to turn a profit." The threat was not a bluff. Litigation freezes were the primary weapon of vulture funds. They understood that time was the enemy of any industrial turnaround. If they froze the accounts, the workers would walk out, the clients would cancel their contracts, and my investors would panic. The factory would bleed to death, and Vanguard would gladly pick the meat off the bones in bankruptcy court. "I am fighting a war on two fronts," I thought to myself, maintaining a stoic, unreadable expression. Inside these walls, my sister was plotting a desperate revenge, terrified that her felony embezzlement was about to be exposed. My parents were trapped in a web of leveraged retirement accounts, ready to say or do anything to survive. And outside these walls, a billion-dollar corporate predator was preparing to burn the entire battlefield to the ground. "What is your proposed resolution?" I asked. Thorne relaxed back into his chair, satisfied that I understood the stakes. "We are reasonable people," he said smoothly. "Vanguard is willing to waive the breach of contract penalty and drop the injunction. In exchange, you will grant us a 49% equity stake in the restructured company, along with 3 permanent seats on the board of directors. We share the risk, we share the reward." It was a parasitic offer. They wanted half of my company and the power to dictate operations, all without spending a single dollar of actual capital. They were using my father's catastrophic stupidity to extort me. "I need 48 hours to review the covenant language with my legal team," I replied, my voice steady. Thorne stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Take all the time you need," he said, turning toward the door. "But be advised, our legal department will file the injunction paperwork on Thursday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I suggest you have a signature ready by then." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet office. The pounding of the hydraulic presses downstairs felt louder now, a constant reminder of the lives depending on my next move. I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out the original Vanguard contract, setting it next to the folder containing Vanessa's fake vendor invoices. I needed a strategy that would neutralize Thorne without sacrificing half of my company. I needed a loophole. I began dissecting the legal phrasing of the representations and warranties section. Richard had guaranteed the operational health of the facility. He had presented Vanguard with financial statements demonstrating sufficient cash flow to service their predatory loan, but I knew those financial statements were entirely fabricated. They were artificially inflated by the ghost inventory Vanessa had been purchasing through her shell corporation. The gears in my mind began to lock into place. If Richard signed the Vanguard contract using fraudulent financial documents, the agreement was voidable from inception. It was legally unenforceable. But the only way to prove the financial documents were fraudulent was to expose the embezzlement scheme that caused the discrepancies. To break the chains Vanguard had wrapped around my company, I had to prove that my own father committed corporate fraud when he applied for the loan. I had to force him to admit that he had no idea his golden child was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars right under his nose. I had to use the rot inside my family to poison the sharks circling outside. I looked toward the large window facing east where the distant skyline of Philadelphia was obscured by the morning fog. Independence always requires a fracture. You cannot free yourself from a toxic system without breaking the foundation it was built upon. I picked up my red pen, turned to a fresh page in my legal pad, and began drafting the exact sequence of events required to spring the trap. The drive east on Interstate 76 provided a necessary physical barrier between myself and the suffocating atmosphere of the factory. I needed silence. I needed a vantage point removed from the smell of burning carbon and the weight of my father's impending ruin. The gray winter sky hung low over the Pennsylvania landscape as I navigated the winding curves of the highway toward downtown Philadelphia. My mind churned through the legal statutes regarding corporate fraud, predatory lending, and mezzanine financing covenants. I was searching for the precise pressure point that would cause the Vanguard Capital contract to collapse under its own weight. I parked my vehicle in a commercial garage near Independence National Historical Park. The biting wind whipped across the open pedestrian walkways, sending tourists hurrying toward the heated museums and cafes. I walked with deliberate steps toward the glass pavilion housing the Liberty Bell. The structure was cold, austere, and perfectly transparent. I stood behind the security barrier, looking at the massive bronze artifact resting under the ambient museum lighting. Most people visit this site to connect with a sanitized version of early American history. They take photographs and purchase souvenirs. I came here for a completely different reason. I came to look at the crack. The famous fissure travels deep up the side of the bell, a fatal structural flaw that renders the object entirely useless for its original purpose. If you struck that bronze today, it would not ring. It would produce a dull, broken thud. But that very fracture is exactly what makes the bell iconic. The damage is the identity. The curators did not attempt to melt it down, patch the bronze, or hide the imperfection behind a layer of fresh paint. They placed the broken reality on display for the entire world to witness. Growing up in the Jenkins household, the concept of transparency was treated like a mortal sin. My mother Brenda and my father Richard spent their entire adult lives desperately patching over their financial and emotional fractures. They applied thick layers of cosmetic wealth to hide the structural decay of our family. They leased luxury vehicles they could not afford. They smiled for country club photographs while their bank accounts bled dry. They taught Vanessa that maintaining a flawless exterior was the only currency that truly mattered. When I pointed out the cracks in their business model years ago, they banished me because I threatened their carefully curated illusion. Standing there in the chilling pavilion, staring at the jagged split in the bronze, the ultimate strategy crystallized in my mind. I had been approaching the Vanguard Capital threat from the wrong angle. Miles Thorne expected me to behave like a typical corporate executive. He assumed I would negotiate in secret, desperate to keep the scandalous details of my father's incompetence hidden from the public record. He believed I would surrender half of my newly acquired company just to avoid the embarrassment of a messy, prolonged civil litigation over a fraudulent loan. He was relying on my ingrained familial instinct to cover up the rot. I decided in that exact moment to do the exact opposite. I was going to smash the illusion entirely. I was going to let the flawed structure crack wide open. My masterstroke required absolute ruthless transparency. I needed to expose the Vanguard contract not merely as a predatory lending tactic, but as a transaction fundamentally built upon a foundation of active felony embezzlement. The Vanguard agreement contained strict representations and warranties. Richard had legally sworn that his financial disclosures were accurate, but those disclosures were artificially inflated by the hundreds of thousands of dollars Vanessa had been funneling through her fake shell corporation, Apex Industrial Supply. If Vanguard attempted to enforce their contract in a court of law, they would have to submit those financial records into the public domain. And once I proved those records were the product of a criminal enterprise, Vanguard would be legally exposed. State and federal regulators despise vulture capitalist firms that knowingly traffic in fraudulent assets. The moment Thorne realized his firm was stepping into a federal criminal investigation, he would drop the contract and run. Vanguard preferred to operate in the shadows, bullying desperate debtors. They could not survive the blistering heat of a public regulatory audit. But neutralizing the external threat was only half of the equation. To execute this maneuver flawlessly, I needed Richard to willingly participate in his own downfall. I could not simply present the evidence to Vanguard myself. The confession had to come directly from the man who signed the fraudulent covenant. I turned away from the Liberty Bell, my resolve hardening into something impenetrable. I walked back out into the freezing Philadelphia wind, pulling my wool coat tighter around my shoulders. The path to victory was clear, but it required orchestrating a confrontation more brutal than anything my family had ever experienced. I needed to force Richard to sit at a table with Miles Thorne and formally admit that he lacked the legal authority to sign the preliminary agreement. I needed my father to confess out loud and on the record that he had already defaulted on his primary commercial loans before Vanguard ever arrived. I needed him to acknowledge that he had presented manipulated ledgers. I needed the proud, booming patriarch to look a corporate shark in the eye and admit that he was completely, hopelessly incompetent. Getting Richard to willingly surrender his pride seemed impossible. But I possessed the one piece of leverage powerful enough to break him. I held the undeniable proof of Vanessa and her crimes. Richard loved his golden child more than he loved his own dignity. He would do whatever was necessary to keep his favorite daughter out of a federal penitentiary. I retrieved my phone as I reached the parking garage. I drafted a concise, formal email to Miles Thorne requesting an urgent in-person meeting at the factory the following morning to discuss the immediate resolution of his mezzanine financing contract. I hit send, feeling a surge of cold anticipation. Then I composed a text message to my father and my sister. The wording was devoid of any emotional warmth. It was a simple, non-negotiable directive. I demanded their presence in the executive boardroom at 9 o'clock the next morning. I warned them that failure to attend would result in an immediate phone call to the Financial Crimes Division of the State Police. I drove back westward across the state, the heater in my vehicle pushing back the winter chill. The pieces were moving perfectly into position. My family had spent decades building a house of cards, terrified of a single gust of wind. They had no idea I was returning to the factory, not with a gentle breeze, but with a hurricane. Tomorrow morning, the executive boardroom would transform into a tribunal. The shadows would be stripped away. Every lie, every stolen dollar, and every desperate illegal signature would be laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. I was going to force my father and my sister to look at the massive fatal crack in their legacy. And the audience waiting in the wings was a corporate predator who was about to realize he had walked blindly into my trap. The real conflict was no longer about whether I could save the company. The company was already mine. The conflict was about exactly how much collateral damage Richard and Vanessa were willing to endure before they finally surrendered their delusional entitlement. I pulled into the industrial district as the sun began to set again, ready to deliver an ultimatum that would leave them with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The executive boardroom of Jenkins Manufacturing was a space designed to intimidate. The centerpiece was a long table carved from solid Pennsylvania oak, surrounded by 12 heavy leather chairs. I arrived at 8:30 in the morning to arrange the room. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed a low, steady note that resonated in the quiet space. I placed 3 distinct items on the polished wood in front of the seat my father had occupied for 3 decades. The first was the thick binder containing my finalized buyout of the commercial debt. The second was the thin manila envelope holding the undeniable proof of embezzlement. The third was the cream-colored agreement from Vanguard Capital. I sat at the head of the table and waited for the architects of my misery to arrive. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden door swung inward. Richard entered first. His tailored charcoal suit looked wrinkled as if he had slept in it. The booming patriarch who had ordered me out of his house on Thanksgiving was gone. In his place stood an aging man carrying the immense weight of impending ruin. Vanessa trailed close behind him. She had abandoned her designer camel hair coat and her suede stiletto boots. She wore a simple dark sweater and sensible shoes. Her face was pale and devoid of her usual flawless makeup. They looked like exhausted strangers. They took their seats at the far end of the oak table, putting as much physical distance between us as the room allowed. The air felt thick and heavy with unspoken dread. I did not offer them coffee or morning pleasantries. I picked up the manila envelope and slid it down the center of the table. It came to a smooth stop mere inches from my sister's trembling hands. "Open it," I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly level. Vanessa hesitated. She glanced at our father for permission, a lifelong habit she could not break even now. Richard gave a stiff, uncertain nod. She pulled the flap back and extracted the top sheet of paper. It was a printed copy of a fraudulent invoice from Apex Industrial Supply, placed side by side with the bank routing numbers tying the account directly to her personal checking. I watched the remaining color drain from her face. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. She dropped the paper as if it had burned her fingers. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice strained and quiet. "That is the true cost of your golden child," I replied. "For the past 3 years, Vanessa has been authorizing payments for ghost materials. She funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the operational budget directly into a shell corporation registered in her own name. She stole the worker bonuses to fund her ski trips and her diamond earrings. She committed grand larceny right under your nose while you praised her business acumen." Richard turned to stare at Vanessa. His favorite daughter, the one he had chosen to lead his legacy over me, shrank back into her leather chair. She could not even meet his gaze. She stared at the polished oak, her shoulders trembling. The silence in the room was suffocating. The grand illusion of their aristocratic lifestyle was dead on the table. "But her theft is only half of our current dilemma," I continued, shattering the quiet. Before my father could fully process the depth of the betrayal, I slid the cream-colored contract toward him. "You signed this preliminary financing covenant with Vanguard Capital 6 days ago. You pledged the factory assets as collateral to a firm known throughout the steel industry for predatory liquidation." Richard swallowed hard. He stared at his own signature in blue ink. "I was trying to save the company, Clara," he rasped, his pride crumbling into pathetic excuses. "The bank was calling the primary loans. I needed a cash injection to cover the margins. I told you we could fix this." "You cannot fix a lethal structural flaw with more toxic debt," I stated coldly. "When you signed that covenant, you legally warranted that your financial disclosures were accurate. You swore to Vanguard that your ledgers were sound. But those ledgers were artificially inflated by Vanessa's felony embezzlement. You committed corporate fraud to secure a loan from the most ruthless vulture fund in the state. And their representative is currently waiting for a reason to freeze every asset in this building and drag you into civil court." The power dynamic in the room inverted entirely. The men and women who had laughed at me just days ago were now staring into a dark, bottomless abyss of their own making. They were drowning, and I was the only person holding a life raft. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat or scream. True power requires no theatrical volume. I pulled 2 crisp legal documents from my portfolio and placed them gently on the desk. "You have exactly one choice today," I announced. Option 1, you both sign these official letters of resignation. You sign the attached non-disclosure agreements relinquishing any future claims to this company, to its assets, and to me. You walk away today with a nominal severance package that will cover your basic living expenses for the next 6 months. If you choose this path, I will personally handle Vanguard Capital. I will use the leverage of this fraudulent contract to force them away, and I will keep the embezzlement files locked in my secure vault. You will lose your titles, but you will keep your freedom. I paused, letting the weight of the offer settle over them. Option 2, I continued, my tone dropping to a chilling whisper. You refuse to sign. If you choose option 2, I will hand this manila envelope over to the Pennsylvania state authorities before lunch. Vanessa will face an immediate indictment for wire fraud. I will then hand the fraudulent Vanguard covenant directly back to Miles Thorne. I will allow his firm to tear your remaining personal assets to shreds in civil court. They will seize your suburban estate, they will liquidate your retirement funds, and they will leave you with nothing but legal fees you cannot afford to pay. Richard looked at the resignation papers. His hands shook uncontrollably as he realized the legacy he had prioritized over his own flesh and blood was permanently gone. He had spent his entire life building an empire upon patriarchal dominance, only to watch it crumble because he trusted a thief and signed a desperate, foolish contract. He looked at Vanessa, who was quietly sobbing into her hands, facing the terrifying reality of a federal penitentiary. The choice was a mere formality. They had no moves left on the board. They were entirely at my mercy, stripped of their unearned pride and forced to accept their total defeat. I sat in the silence, watching the realization wash over them. Richard reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the silver pen resting beside the documents. He signed his name on the dotted line, his signature jagged and weak. He slid the paper toward Vanessa. She picked up the pen. Her tears dripped onto the oak table, but as she brought the ink down to the paper, her sobbing paused for just a fraction of a second. She wiped her eyes, and underneath the curtain of her dark hair, I caught a fleeting glimpse of something else. It was not defeat. It was a cold, calculated smirk. She was signing her name on the dotted line to save herself from prison, but her mind was already executing a different, far more destructive plan. I watched the ink flow across the page, my intuition flashing a sudden brilliant warning that this surrender was nothing but a smokescreen. The scratch of the silver pen against the crisp resignation document sounded incredibly loud in the cavernous boardroom. Vanessa pushed the paper back across the polished oak table. She stood up, smoothing the front of her dark sweater with trembling fingers. Richard followed suit, moving with the slow, labored gait of a man who had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. They played their parts flawlessly. They embodied the defeated patriarch and the humbled sister stripped of their power and banished from the kingdom they had mismanaged. They walked toward the heavy wooden door without speaking another word. I remained seated at the head of the table, organizing the signed non-disclosure agreements into a neat pile. As Vanessa reached the exit, she paused. She turned her head slightly, glancing back at the executive desk visible through the glass partition of the adjacent office. I watched her profile carefully. For a fraction of a second, the mask of tearful humiliation slipped. The corner of her mouth twitched upward into a sharp, triumphant smirk. It was a micro-expression, fleeting and subtle, but it screamed of hidden intent. Then she turned the brass knob and disappeared into the hallway, trailing behind our shattered father. The boardroom settled into a suffocating silence, but my heart began to hammer against my ribs. I recognized that specific smirk. When we were children, Vanessa possessed a terrifying capacity for vindictive sabotage. If she lost a board game, she would quietly slide a crucial game piece down the heating vent so nobody else could ever play it again. She operated on a core philosophy of total destruction. If she could not possess the prize, she would burn the prize to ashes to ensure no one else could enjoy it. My intuition flared cold and urgent. She had surrendered the company far too easily. She signed the resignation papers because she believed there would be no company left to govern by tomorrow morning. I left the boardroom and sprinted into my office. I dropped into the leather chair and unlocked my workstation. During the weekend buyout, my private equity team had installed advanced diagnostic software across the Jenkins manufacturing network to monitor the transition. I pulled up the primary dashboard. The surface metrics looked perfectly normal. Payroll was processing. The supply chain logistics were functioning. But I dug deeper, accessing the administrative security logs. I bypassed the standard user interface and opened the raw data streams running through the central servers. It took me 45 minutes of parsing through thousands of lines of code to find the anomaly. Buried deep within the automated maintenance protocols, hidden beneath layers of routine system updates, was a heavily encrypted executable file. It was a logic bomb, a dormant piece of malware designed to wake up at a specific time and execute a devastating command. I checked the execution parameters. The countdown timer was set for exactly midnight tonight. I analyzed the target pathways. The engineered code was not aimed at the financial ledgers. It was designed to bypass the firewalls and burrow directly into the proprietary engineering database and the master client directory. It was a digital acid wash. If that payload deployed, it would systematically wipe every single manufacturing blueprint, every custom metallurgical formula, and every client contact our grandfather had spent 50 years compiling. The physical machinery on the floor would become useless metal husks because we would lack the schematics to program them. The business would be instantly, permanently blinded. Vanguard Capital would not even need to sue us. We would simply cease to exist. I grabbed my phone and dialed Elias. He was a freelance cybersecurity contractor I retained for high-level corporate audits, a brilliant architect of digital defense who treated code like a living, breathing organism. He possessed a background in counterintelligence before moving to the private sector, making him uniquely qualified to handle corporate sabotage. I explained the situation in 3 terse sentences. He told me to keep the servers online and promised to arrive within 20 minutes. The afternoon sun sank below the industrial skyline, casting long, menacing shadows across the factory floor. Elias arrived carrying a heavy aluminum briefcase. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He was a man of intense focus, wearing a faded black hooded sweatshirt and wire-rimmed glasses. I led him directly to the secure server room located in the basement of the administrative wing. The temperature dropped significantly as we entered the climate-controlled space. Rows of black server racks hummed loudly, glowing with thousands of blinking blue and green indicator lights. Elias connected his specialized diagnostic laptop directly to the primary mainframe. His fingers flew across the keyboard with blinding speed. The screen reflected in his glasses as lines of dense code cascaded downward. I stood behind him watching the digital battlefield unfold. The clock on the wall read 11:15. We had 45 minutes before the logic bomb detonated and vaporized the entire legacy of Jenkins Manufacturing. "This is sophisticated work," Elias murmured, his eyes never leaving the monitor. She did not write this herself. She purchased a military-grade wiping tool from the dark web and embedded it using her executive administrative privileges. The encryption is actively fighting my containment protocols. It is designed to fragment and multiply if it senses an unauthorized deletion attempt. We cannot delete it, I realized, my mind racing through the strategic implications. If we try to kill the program, it might trigger an early deployment. We have to isolate it. We have to build a digital quarantine box around the executable file and let it detonate inside a vacuum. Elias nodded, his jaw clenched tight. He began constructing a virtual machine, a fake digital environment mimicking our actual database. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 11:30, 11:45. The hum of the cooling fans felt deafening in the enclosed space. I watched the progress bar on his screen crawl toward completion. If this failed, my entire investment portfolio would collapse, and the hundreds of workers upstairs would arrive tomorrow morning to find the doors permanently locked. At 11:56, Elias executed the quarantine command. The screen froze for a terrifying 5 seconds. Then a green confirmation window popped open. He had successfully lured the malware into the virtual sandbox and severed its connection to the main network. We stood in silence as the digital clock rolled over to midnight. Inside the isolated virtual environment, the logic bomb detonated harmlessly, destroying fake data while the actual Jenkins Manufacturing blueprints remained perfectly secure. We had won. The company was safe. Elias disconnected his hardware, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He turned to me and handed me a printed physical readout. He had not just neutralized the threat, he had traced the origin of the deployment. The log proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the malicious software was uploaded from Vanessa's personal laptop using her specific Internet Protocol address while she was sitting in the executive suite yesterday afternoon. I stared at the printed page. My family had pushed beyond mere financial greed or pathetic entitlement. This was calculated, unadulterated malice. They were willing to destroy hundreds of innocent lives and salt the earth behind them out of pure, venomous spite. They thought they could sign a peace treaty with their right hand while holding a dagger in their left, but their treachery had just handed me the ultimate weapon. I folded the forensic report and placed it in my pocket. The time for negotiations was over. Tomorrow morning, I was going to unleash a legal firestorm that would scorch their lives down to the bedrock. The morning sun crested the jagged Pennsylvania skyline, casting a harsh golden light across the industrial park. Inside the manufacturing facility, the day shift roared to life. The heavy hydraulic presses began their rhythmic pounding, shaking the concrete floor with a reassuring, productive violence. The scent of hot steel and fresh machine oil filtered through the ventilation grates. It was the smell of victory. I stood by the large window in the executive suite, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the workers below maneuver massive coils of raw aluminum. My family had intended for this building to be a silent, paralyzed tomb by dawn. Instead, the plant was humming with renewed vigor. I turned away from the window and walked back to the mahogany desk. The forensic report Elias had generated sat directly in the center of the leather blotter. I picked up my phone and dialed David Cole. My acquisitions attorney answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and alert despite the early hour. When I first built my investment firm, I spent months interviewing legal counsel. I needed someone who understood that corporate restructuring was not a gentlemanly pursuit, it was warfare. David possessed a brilliant tactical mind and a profound lack of mercy when dealing with hostile adversaries. I explained the events of the previous night in meticulous detail. I read him the technical specifications of the malware, the exact timestamps of the deployment, and the digital fingerprint proving the sabotage originated from my sister's personal computer. "I want a civil lawsuit filed before the courthouse opens to the general public," I instructed, keeping my tone frigid and precise. "Sue them for intentional interference with prospective economic advantage, gross breach of fiduciary duty, and civil conspiracy. I want the damages calculated based on the total valuation of this entire company, including projected future earnings." David let out a low whistle of appreciation over the cellular connection. He did not ask if I was certain. He simply began formulating the strategy. He suggested we immediately file an emergency ex parte motion for a preliminary injunction, a legal maneuver that would freeze their remaining assets pending the outcome of the trial. I agreed instantly, but I wanted to take the retaliation a step further. Because Richard and Brenda had foolishly tied their suburban estate and their retirement accounts to the subordinate debt of the company, I directed David to file a notice of pending litigation against their primary residence. The legal term is lis pendens. It effectively attaches the potential astronomical damages of the lawsuit directly to the deed of their home. They would be unable to sell, refinance, or borrow against the property. Their house would become a concrete anchor tied around their necks. By 9 o'clock, the legal filings were processed, stamped, and dispatched. I did not summon my family to a meeting. I knew they would come to me. Arrogance and curiosity are a potent combination. They would not be able to resist driving past the facility to witness the devastation they believed they had caused. They wanted to see panicked employees standing in the parking lot. They wanted to see me broken and defeated, begging them for help. At 9:30, the familiar silver luxury vehicle pulled into the visitor lot. I watched from the second-floor window as Richard, Brenda, and Vanessa emerged from the car. They stood on the pavement, staring up at the billowing smokestacks. I could read the profound confusion radiating from their posture. The air was filled with the deafening noise of active production. Semi-trucks were backing into the loading bays, receiving fresh shipments of finished parts. The business they tried to murder was thriving. I exited my office and walked down the carpeted hallway to the reception area. Martha looked up from her computer screen, her eyes wide as she watched me position myself near the front entrance. I was not alone. 2 towering process servers dressed in nondescript dark suits stood flanking the glass doors. A pair of uniformed security guards waited a few paces behind them. The glass doors slid open. My family walked into the lobby, bringing a gust of freezing winter air with them. Vanessa looked frantic, her eyes darting toward the active computer terminals on the administrative desks. Richard wore an expression of bewildered rage, his face flushed a deep crimson. Brenda clutched her designer handbag, sensing that the atmosphere in the room was entirely wrong for a funeral. "Why are the machines running?" Vanessa blurted out, losing every ounce of her sophisticated composure. "The servers were supposed to be offline. We drove by to check on the transition and the entire plant is operating." She caught herself clamping her mouth shut, realizing she had just vocalized her guilty knowledge. "The servers are functioning perfectly," I replied, stepping forward to meet them. "The custom client databases are secure. The engineering blueprints are safely locked behind a new impenetrable firewall. Your little midnight project was quarantined and neutralized inside a virtual sandbox before it could erase a single line of proprietary code." Vanessa turned a sickening shade of pale. She stumbled backward, bumping into our father. Richard caught her arm, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What midnight project?" he demanded, looking back and forth between us. "Clara, what is she talking about?" I did not answer him. I simply nodded to the men in the dark suits. The process servers stepped forward in perfect unison. They extended thick manila envelopes, pressing the heavy legal packets directly against the chests of my father and my sister. "Richard Jenkins, you have been served," the first man stated with practiced apathy. "Vanessa Jenkins, you have been served," the second man echoed, stepping back and clearing the space. Richard fumbled with the clasp on the envelope. He pulled out the towering stack of legal documents bound by a blue cardboard backing. His eyes scanned the bold black text on the front page. "Civil complaint for damages, breach of fiduciary duty, corporate sabotage." I watched the exact moment his reality shattered. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "You are suing us," he choked out, his voice a fragile broken rasp. "We signed the resignation papers. We surrendered the company to you. You promised you would let us walk away." "I promised to let you walk away if you signed those documents in good faith," I corrected him, my voice devoid of any warmth. "But your daughter decided to execute a scorched earth policy as she walked out the door. She planted a military-grade logic bomb in the central mainframe. She tried to permanently wipe the digital infrastructure of this entire organization out of pure vindictive spite." Brenda gasped, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. She turned to look at her golden child, horrified. "Vanessa," she whispered, "tell me you did not do something so incredibly stupid." Vanessa could not speak. She stared at the floor, tears of genuine terror spilling over her cheeks. The smug smirk she wore yesterday was permanently erased. "We hired a forensic cybersecurity specialist," I explained, driving the final nails into their coffin. "He traced the deployment of the malware. I possess a certified digital log proving the virus originated from an Internet Protocol address registered to your personal laptop, executed while you were sitting in the executive suite. The evidence is irrefutable. You did not just break a contract, you committed a severe federal crime." I turned my attention back to my father. "You are named as a co-conspirator in this civil action because you granted her the administrative privileges used to access the servers I set. My legal team is seeking $30 million in total damages, and because you tied your personal finances to the corporate debt, the court granted our motion to attach your assets." I gestured to the specific page buried in his stack of paperwork. "A notice of pending litigation has been officially filed against the deed to your suburban estate," I revealed. "Your house is now collateral against the damages you caused. You cannot sell it. You cannot borrow against it. If we win this trial, and we absolutely will win this trial, the court will seize your home and liquidate your retirement accounts to satisfy the judgment." Brenda let out a sharp, devastated cry. She collapsed against the reception desk, her knees buckling under the weight of total financial ruin. Richard dropped the blue folder onto the linoleum floor. The pages scattered, spreading out like a fan around his expensive leather shoes. They had tried to destroy my paperwork by erasing the servers. In return, I weaponized the judicial system against them. The paper trail I constructed was a flawless, undeniable fortress that completely crushed their delusions of grandeur. The power dynamic was permanently inverted, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and a towering mountain of debt. I motioned to the security guards. "Please escort these individuals off the premises." I instructed clearly, if they ever set foot on this property again, you are to arrest them for criminal trespassing. I turned my back on them and walked away, ignoring the sounds of my mother sobbing and my father begging for a second chance. The internal corporate war was officially over. I had secured the facility and neutralized the internal threat. But as I rode the elevator back up to the executive suite, a new, highly complicated problem began to formulate in my mind. Filing a lawsuit of this magnitude automatically enters the details into the public record. The local business journalists monitor the courthouse dockets daily. The allegations of embezzlement, predatory loans, and corporate sabotage were no longer a family secret. The story was going to break within hours, and tomorrow evening, the entire Pennsylvania industrial elite was scheduled to gather for the most prestigious charity gala of the winter season, an event my family had attended religiously for 20 years. The private victory was secure, but the public reckoning was about to begin, and the fallout within their high society circle would be swift and merciless. The wheels of the judicial system grind slowly, but the gossip mill of the Pennsylvania industrial elite operates at lightning speed. Civil complaints filed in the county courthouse are matters of public record. By Wednesday afternoon, a junior reporter for a local business journal pulled the docket. The details of the $30 million litigation were published online before the evening commute. The article detailed the predatory Vanguard covenant, the fraudulent asset leverage, the digital sabotage attempt, and the forensic evidence of wire fraud. My parents had spent 2 decades cultivating a pristine social image. They hosted lavish charity dinners, donated conspicuous sums to local hospital boards, and ensured their photograph appeared in every high society magazine print run. They treated their reputation like a fragile glass sculpture, polishing it daily to hide the structural cracks. But in the tightly woven network of steel executives and regional bankers, reputation is currency, and that currency evaporates the moment insolvency and felony theft enter the conversation. The annual Keystone Foundation Gala took place on Saturday evening. It was the premier event of the winter season, held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel. For years, Brenda and Richard used this specific gathering to cement their status, parading Vanessa around the room while leaving me at home. Tonight, the dynamic was permanently altered. I arrived at the venue wearing a tailored emerald gown that projected quiet authority. I did not attend to gloat or to seek petty vengeance. I attended as the chief executive officer of a revitalized manufacturing firm. I needed to reassure our primary vendors and local politicians that the internal chaos was resolved and the assembly lines were operating at maximum capacity. The ballroom was a sensory overload of crystal chandeliers, cascading floral arrangements, and the soft strains of a string quartet playing in the corner. Waiters navigated the crowded floor carrying silver trays of champagne flutes. As I walked down the grand staircase, I noticed the subtle shift in the room. In previous years, these people would have offered me a polite nod before returning to their conversations. Tonight, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Several prominent logistics contractors and supply chain directors stepped forward to greet me, extending their hands and offering congratulations on a brilliant acquisition. I had proven my competence in the most brutal arena possible, and they recognized a winner. 30 minutes later, the atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly cooled. I stood near a towering ice sculpture discussing fourth-quarter shipping logistics with a prominent regional banker. I glanced toward the entrance. Richard, Brenda, and Vanessa were standing at the top of the stairs. They had attempted to dress the part, wearing their customary formal attire, but the invisible armor of their wealth was gone. They looked hollow. As they descended into the crowd, the true punishment began. It was not loud or confrontational. It was a masterclass in polite societal shunning. When Richard approached a group of his former golfing partners, the men suddenly found reasons to check their watches and walk toward the bar. When Vanessa offered a smile to the daughters of a real estate developer, the young women turned their backs and formed a closed circle. The physical space around my relatives expanded. People literally stepped out of their path, treating them like a contagious disease. Brenda surveyed the freezing room, her panic mounting. She realized their social exile was total and permanent. Then her eyes locked onto me. I saw the desperate calculation flash across her face. She needed a public lifeline. She believed that if she could force me to accept an apology in front of these wealthy patrons, the community would be forced to forgive them as well. She intended to weaponize polite society against me. She marched across the ballroom floor, dragging Richard and Vanessa in her wake. The crowd parted, sensing the impending collision. The low murmur of conversation around the ice sculpture died away. Dozens of influential guests fell silent, turning their attention to the unfolding spectacle. Clara Brenda called out, pitching her voice to a theatrical trembling volume, designed to carry across the room. She closed the distance, her hands outstretched, her eyes shimmering with manufactured tears. I did not step forward to meet her. I remained perfectly still, holding my crystal glass. My darling girl Brenda wept, stopping just 2 feet away. "Please, we are family. This silly misunderstanding has gone far enough. Your father is falling apart. We love you so much. Just drop this terrible lawsuit and come home so we can heal." It was a brilliant manipulative trap. Society expects women to prioritize harmony over justice. The unwritten rules of high society demanded that I lower my voice, hush my weeping mother, and step into a private corridor to avoid causing a scene. If I reacted with anger, I would look unhinged. If I comforted her, I surrendered my leverage. I took a slow breath, centering my thoughts on the Liberty Bell, remembering that a crack must be displayed to hold any true meaning. I did not shrink. I did not lower my voice. "I cannot drop the litigation, Brenda," I replied, my tone carrying the crisp, resonant clarity of breaking glass. The acoustic properties of the ballroom amplified my words, ensuring every single guest within a 50-foot radius heard the response. Brenda froze, her outstretched hands hovering in the air. She blinked, thrown off balance by my use of her first name. "The lawsuit is a necessary measure to recover the $482,000 your golden child rooted through fraudulent vendor invoices." I continued, maintaining perfect, icy politeness. A collective gasp echoed from the surrounding circle of onlookers. The banking executive beside me raised his eyebrows, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You cannot expect me to abandon a fiduciary duty simply because we share genetics," I explained calmly. Vanessa utilized a fake shell corporation to purchase diamond earrings and ski chalets using money stolen from the factory payroll. Furthermore, the state regulatory boards are already reviewing the digital logs, proving she planted a military-grade computer virus in the corporate servers. You cannot sweep felony sabotage and grand larceny under a rug and call it a silly misunderstanding. The silence that followed was profound. The string quartet had stopped playing. The elite members of the Pennsylvania business community stared at my mother with undisguised disgust. I had laid the ugly, undeniable truth bare under the chandelier lights, citing the exact stolen dollar amount. There was no room left for spin or interpretation. Brenda opened her mouth, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. Her face turned an ashen, sickly gray. Richard stared at the marble floor, his shoulders hunched, his patriarchal pride crushed into dust. Vanessa looked like she wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. "I offer you my sincerest wish for luck in your upcoming criminal defense hearings," I said, raising my glass in a mock toast. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have actual business to discuss with people who earn their capital legally." I turned back to the banking executive and resumed our conversation regarding shipping logistics. I did not look back. I heard the frantic, humiliating sound of my relatives retreating. They practically ran toward the coat check, fleeing the ballroom under the searing judgment of their former peers. Their social currency was officially bankrupt. Every lie they had ever told to inflate their status was exposed. I spent the remainder of the evening securing 3 new distribution contracts, proving that quiet ambition and raw determination are the only currencies that endure. But as I drove home to my private residence later that night, a lingering sense of caution shadowed my victory. Humiliation is a dangerous catalyst. Stripped of their company, their wealth, and their social standing, my relatives had nowhere left to hide. And when desperate people run out of options, they inevitably show up at your front door, seeking one final, catastrophic confrontation. Sunday evening settled over my neighborhood with a heavy, suffocating layer of frost. I lived in a modern, secure townhome located in a quiet district overlooking the frozen river. The interior design was minimalist, favoring clean lines and neutral tones. It was a sanctuary I built with my own capital, entirely separate from the suffocating, heavy mahogany aesthetic of my childhood. I sat on my living room sofa, enjoying the rare sensation of absolute silence. The financial markets were closed. The factory was secured for the night. The devastating public spectacle at the charity gala was 48 hours behind me. I poured a glass of sparkling water and opened a new book, relishing the profound peace that comes from knowing your enemies are permanently disarmed. The digital chime of my front gate security system shattered the calm. I checked the video monitor mounted near the entryway. Two figures stood shivering on the exposed concrete step, illuminated by the harsh glare of the motion sensor light. Richard and Brenda. They had bypassed the community gate by tailgating another resident, a desperate maneuver for people who once prided themselves on following the strict rules of polite society. I watched them through the high-definition camera. They did not look like the arrogant titans of industry who had ordered me out of their dining room just days prior. They looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. The freezing wind whipped at their coats. I could have simply ignored the notification and allowed them to freeze on the porch, but leaving a wound open invites infection. True independence requires a clean surgical cut. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The biting winter air rushed into my heated foyer, carrying the bitter scent of impending snow. My parents stood on the threshold, their breath pluming in white clouds under the porch light. Brenda wore a thick mink coat, pulling the collar tight around her neck. Her face was entirely devoid of makeup, revealing deep, dark circles under her eyes. Richard stood beside her, his shoulders slumped, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his wool overcoat. He could not even meet my gaze. He stared at the welcome mat, a broken king standing at the gates of a kingdom he used to mock. "Clara," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling violently from the cold and the sheer humiliation of her current position. "Thank you for opening the door. Please let us come inside. It is freezing out here." "You can speak from exactly where you are standing," I replied, maintaining my position in the doorway, physically blocking their entry into my sanctuary. "Tell me your purpose for coming to my home uninvited." Richard finally lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot and wet. "We came to apologize," he rasped the words, sounding foreign and clumsy in his mouth. "We handled the corporate transition poorly. We let our pride get the better of us. We are your parents, and we want to make things right between us." Brenda nodded frantically, stepping closer to the invisible barrier of the doorway. "We want to be a real family again, Clara," she pleaded. "We see your immense value now. You have proven yourself beyond any shadow of a doubt. You are brilliant. You saved the factory when we could not. We want to honor your success." I watched their faces carefully parsing the desperation hidden beneath the sudden flood of parental affection. They were not apologizing for decades of emotional neglect or toxic favoritism. They were apologizing because they were cornered. I processed their words the exact same way I processed a corporate merger, scanning the verbal contract for the hidden clauses and the ultimate cost. "Honor my success how I asked," keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. "We will treat you as an absolute equal." Richard offered, a desperate eagerness bleeding into his voice. "You can sit at the head of the table during Sunday dinners. We will publicly acknowledge your leadership at the country club. You will finally have the respect you always deserved from this family. We just need you to drop the civil litigation." Brenda reached out, letting her bare hand hover in the freezing air between us. "Release the lien on our house, Clara," she begged. "Tell the state authorities you made a mistake regarding the embezzlement files. Let Vanessa come home so we can fix her mistakes privately. If you do this for us, we promise everything will be different. We will give you the love and recognition you have been begging for since you were a little girl." When I remained silent, Richard attempted a different tactical approach. He deployed the ultimate weapon of the desperate patriarch. He reached for nostalgia, attempting to weaponize my own childhood memories against me. "Think about the past," he urged softly. "Remember that Thanksgiving when you were 10 years old? You helped me carve the turkey. You were so proud to stand next to me in the kitchen. We have good memories, Clara. We share a history that cannot be erased by a few bad business decisions. Do not throw your own flesh and blood away over paperwork and pride. We belong together." I stood in the doorway, letting the freezing wind bite at my face. I looked at the man who had laughed while my sister scraped my dinner into the garbage. I looked at the woman who had watched me walk out into the cold night without shedding a single tear. For 29 years, I had craved their validation. I had built an entire investment portfolio, mastered complex financial markets, and accumulated massive wealth, all driven by a quiet, secret hope that one day they would look at me and finally see my worth. But standing here now, listening to them offer me a seat at a dining table they no longer owned, I realized something profound. I searched my chest for the familiar sting of rejection, the burning anger that used to fuel my ambition. It was completely gone. There was no rage left in my heart. There was no sorrow. There was only a vast, empty void. The emotional spell was permanently broken. I did not need their validation anymore because their validation was entirely worthless. They were bankrupt in every conceivable way, morally and financially. "You are offering to sell me your respect," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet, frozen neighborhood. "You are proposing a transaction. You will grant me the illusion of a loving family, and in exchange, I will pay for it by surrendering my legal leverage and financing your fraudulent lifestyle." Brenda flinched, her face twisting in sudden agony. "That is not true, Clara," she cried out, her voice cracking under the strain. "We are trying to heal this family." "You are trying to save your house, Brenda," I corrected her, stripping away the final layer of their delusion. "You do not want a daughter, you want a hostage. You want someone to absorb the devastating consequences of your own staggering incompetence. But respect cannot be extorted. True love cannot be purchased with dropped lawsuits and forgiven debts." Richard opened his mouth, raising his shaking hand in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Clara, please," he choked out, tears finally spilling down his weathered cheeks. "You cannot do this to us. We have nowhere else to go." I looked at them one last time, absorbing the stark reality of their destruction. The people who had held me down for my entire life were now begging at my feet, offering a hollow, conditional apology that I simply no longer wanted. "You should have thought about your final destination before you threw my plate in the trash," I said, my tone carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "You made your choices, now you must live inside them. Do not ever return to this property." I stepped back into the warmth of my foyer. I reached for the heavy oak door. Brenda lunged forward, her fingers grasping desperately at the wooden frame. I did not hesitate. I pushed the door shut, forcing her to pull her hand back to avoid being crushed. The lock clicked into place with a sharp, heavy thud. I engaged the deadbolt, leaving them standing alone in the freezing winter darkness. The emotional conflict was finished. The toxic chains of my past were permanently severed. I walked back into my quiet living room, ready to embrace the dawn of my absolute independence. 6 months have passed since the winter frost froze my parents out of my life permanently. The transition from a freezing November to a sweltering May brought a profound transformation to Jenkins Manufacturing. I stand on the elevated metal catwalk overlooking the main assembly floor. The cavernous room no longer feels like a dying beast on life support. It is a breathing and thriving organism. The oppressive gloom has been replaced by bright industrial lighting that illuminates every corner of the facility. The outdated and dangerous smelting furnaces were hauled away during the spring. We replaced them with modernized and highly automated electric arc systems. The sharp scent of ozone and machine oil remains in the air, but it is no longer mixed with the sickening stench of decay. It smells like progress. It smells like undeniable profit. I walk down the metal-grated stairs, my low heels clicking rhythmically against the steel. The workers do not stop and stare in terrified silence when I pass their stations. Marcus offers a respectful nod, his calloused hands expertly calibrating a new hydraulic press. Dave waves from the shipping bay, directing a massive fleet of outbound delivery trucks filled to the brim with finished aluminum parts. I reinstated their proper wages on my very first day. I implemented a transparent profit-sharing program that rewards efficiency and dedication. The people working on this floor are no longer treated as expendable resources, forced to sacrifice their livelihoods for lazy aristocrats. They are respected partners in a lucrative enterprise. My private equity group injected the necessary capital to save the infrastructure, but it was the fierce loyalty of these men and women that truly pulled the company back from the brink of total collapse. The external threat from Vanguard Capital vanished almost as quickly as it had originally arrived. When my legal team submitted the forensic evidence of wire fraud and corporate sabotage to the state regulatory boards, Miles Thorne realized he had stepped blindly into a massive federal trap. Vulture funds thrive in the dark shadows of civil bankruptcy. They absolutely wither under the blinding spotlight of a criminal investigation. Vanguard formally withdrew their mezzanine financing claim within 48 hours, terrified of being implicated in a complex felony fraud scheme. They retreated to the shadows where they belonged, leaving my company entirely unencumbered and firmly under my sole control. They learned a very harsh lesson about preying on wounded animals without checking the surrounding perimeter for traps. The internal family war concluded with equal and brutal finality. The civil lawsuit I filed against my parents placed an insurmountable financial burden on their fragile house of cards. Facing total ruin and $30 million in legitimate damages, Richard and Brenda were forced to capitulate completely. They signed an ironclad settlement agreement drafted by my attorneys. They surrendered their sprawling suburban estate to the bank to cover the massive secondary liens they had foolishly established years prior. Today, they reside in a cramped two-bedroom apartment complex located directly next to a noisy interstate highway. There are no more catered country club luncheons. There are no more luxury leased vehicles parked in a pristine driveway. They drive a 10-year-old sedan with faded paint and buy their groceries using clipped coupons. The high society elite of Pennsylvania completely erased them from their social registry the moment the scandal became public knowledge. They became invisible ghosts in a town they used to rule, utterly powerless and forgotten by the people they spent their entire lives trying to impress. Vanessa experienced the most severe reckoning of all. The state authorities did not view her midnight sabotage or her fake shell corporation as a simple family dispute. She was indicted by a grand jury on multiple counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. To avoid spending a decade locked inside a federal penitentiary, she accepted a brutal and unforgiving plea deal. She avoided prison time, but the presiding judge ordered her to pay full restitution for every single dollar she embezzled from the corporate accounts. Today, the former vice president of operations does not wear designer camel hair coats or imported silk blouses. She wears a stiff, brightly colored polyester uniform featuring a plastic name tag. She works as a cashier at a discount retail store located in a rundown strip mall on the edge of town. She spends her days standing on her feet for 8 exhaustive hours, ringing up cheap merchandise for frustrated customers who do not care about her past status or her aristocratic delusions. Every Friday, the state automatically garnishes 70% of her minimum wage paycheck to satisfy the court-ordered restitution plan. She is learning the true value of hard manual labor, one excruciating hour at a time, completely trapped in a cage of her own making. I walk past the massive steel presses, feeling the intense heat radiate against my skin. I think about the Liberty Bell, resting inside its glass pavilion back in downtown Philadelphia. For years, I genuinely believed that my family was perfect and I was the broken piece. I thought the fracture in my life was a source of deep personal shame. But I realize now that the fracture is exactly what sets a person free. A bell without a crack is just another anonymous piece of metal. The damage is what gives it a permanent and unforgettable identity. Breaking away from the toxic and suffocating expectations of my parents was the most painful experience of my life, but it was also my ultimate salvation. I stopped trying to fit into a mold that was designed to crush my spirit. I embraced the fracture and allowed the light to pour in. The rhythmic and punishing cadence of the hydraulic machinery pounds through the concrete floorboards beneath my feet. It does not sound like chaotic industrial noise to me anymore. It sounds like a massive bell ringing for independence. It is the beautiful sound of absolute and hard-won freedom. This entire journey proves a fundamental truth about human nature and the reality of modern society. You cannot purchase genuine respect, and you cannot demand blind loyalty through fear and intimidation. True karma rarely arrives in a sudden flash of theatrical lightning. It is delivered slowly and meticulously through ironclad legal documents and relentless hard work. Quiet resilience will always dismantle loud entitlement, and raw determination will ultimately secure the final victory. If you love narratives where quiet resilience dismantles loud entitlement and toxic people finally face reality, you can bring these satisfying arcs to life yourself. Please remember to follow the channel Linda Vengeance to ensure your audience never misses the brilliant fallout of your next great drama. The Architecture of a Fractured Bell, Lessons on Legacy and Truth. The sound of a porcelain plate scraping across a mahogany table and shattering into a stainless steel trash can is more than just the violent end of a Thanksgiving dinner. It is the piercing, unmistakable sound of a family collapsing under the crushing weight of its own delusions. Clara Jenkins' story is a brutal and brilliant mirror held up to the modern household, forcing us to look past the crystal goblets and the roasted sage to see the rot hiding in the floorboards. We are conditioned to revere the traditional American family structure, viewing the dining room table as a sacred altar of unity, respect, and unconditional support. Yet Clara's journey asks a terrifying question. What happens when that altar is built entirely on lies? When we pull back the layers of this corporate and familial warfare, we find profound lessons about parenting, personal responsibility, and the spiritual cost of entitlement. The facade of the American dream. A message to parents. American culture has long worshipped at the altar of success. The traditional ideals of hard work, self-reliance, and providing for the next generation are the bedrock of family education. However, somewhere along the line, the pursuit of character was violently hijacked by the pursuit of prestige. Parents like Richard and Brenda Jenkins represent a tragic distortion of family responsibility. They weaponize their traditional roles, using their authority not to guide their children, but to extort them. True family education is rooted in honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. It requires parents to look at their children clearly, cultivating their unique strengths rather than forcing them to prop up a fragile family ego. The message to American parents is stark and urgent. Your legacy is not the company you build, the zip code you inhabit, or the leased luxury vehicles parked in your driveway. Your true legacy is the moral and emotional compass you instill in your children. When parents favor the compliant, entitled child, the one who maintains the superficial illusion of success, over the honest, resilient child who speaks uncomfortable truths they are not protecting, the family they are actively destroying its foundation. Parenting is not an exercise in public relations. If you raise children to believe that their worth is tethered to their outward appearance and unearned status, you are sending them into the world morally bankrupt and fundamentally defenseless against reality. The Crucible of the Forge, a message to youth. For the younger generation, Clara's ascent from an outcast daughter to the chief executive officer of her own life offers a vital, searing lesson. In a society that frequently pressures young adults to bend to toxic family expectations in the name of harmony, Clara's story stands as a monument to the absolute necessity of boundaries. The message imparted to the youth is one of radical self-reliance. Your worth is not defined by those who are too blind or too frightened to see it. If the people who are supposed to love you demand that you shrink yourself to fit their fragile narratives, you must possess the courage to walk out into the freezing night. You do not have to inherit your family's dysfunction. You can build your own empire out of the very raw materials they discarded. Clara embodies the historic American spirit of independence, the realization that true freedom often requires a fracture. You cannot heal in the exact environment that is actively making you sick. By prioritizing competence over complaining and factual reality over emotional manipulation, young people can learn to become the architects of their own destinies. The Observer's Lens, a spiritual call to self-cultivation. If we elevate our perspective and view this narrative through the lens of a spiritual practitioner observing modern society, the Jenkins family tragedy reveals a profound symptom of a spiritually malnourished culture. We live in an era where individuals desperately cultivate their external image while leaving their internal gardens barren, choked with the weeds of ego, greed, and vanity. From a spiritual standpoint, Richard and Vanessa were not destroyed by Clara's financial acumen. They were destroyed by their own profound attachment to an illusion. They were trapped in a cycle of spiritual poverty, confusing material dominance with actual power. To parents and individuals navigating this modern maze, the call to action is one of deep self-cultivation. We must pivot away from the endless accumulation of status and return to the development of wisdom, morality, and resilience. Wisdom is possessing the clarity to see the illusion of material superiority and recognizing that a title on a brass nameplate cannot shield you from the consequences of your actions. Morality is treating the lowest floor worker with the exact same dignity as the chief executive, understanding that true wealth is found in integrity. Resilience is the quiet, unbreakable peace of walking away from a toxic table, knowing you carry everything you need within your own soul. When we fail to cultivate our inner lives, we become hollow, and hollow things, no matter how beautifully painted or expensively dressed, will always shatter under pressure. The anchor and the abyss. If you find yourself reflecting on the hidden dynamics of your own dining room table, or if you draw strength from narratives where quiet resilience dismantles loud entitlement, I invite you to subscribe to the channel Linda Vengeance to ensure you never miss the fallout of our next great drama. As we look back at the shattered plate and the cold Pennsylvania night, we are left with a quiet, unsettling truth about the nature of love and obligation. We are traditionally taught that family is our anchor in a chaotic world, but perhaps we have fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of the anchor. An anchor is meant to keep a ship from drifting into deadly currents. But if the harbor itself is poisoned, if the water is actively eroding the hull of your ship, the anchor becomes the very thing that drowns you. The greatest betrayal a family can commit is not that they fail to love you. It is that they demand you hate yourself in order to earn their love. And sometimes, the highest, most profound act of love you can offer your family is to let them fall, to deny them the comfort of your complicity, because it is only when the illusions are permanently stripped away and they are left standing in the freezing cold of their own consequences that they might finally learn how to build a fire of their own.